Jeff. Both the humble title and the modest form, I think, belie a brilliant book that unfolds endlessly before the reader. You're accompanied by everyone from Walt Whitman to Simone Weil to Italo Calvino to Virginia Woolf. You discuss the outdated economic model of bookshops to the eternal encounter of souls. You extol community. You lambast, of course, Amazon. We learn about your history as a reader, as a bookseller. We learn about the history of Chicago's celebrated Seminary co-op bookstore, of which you're the director, although, as you said, you've been fairly absent because you've been promoting. It's clear, truly, that a lifetime of reading and reflecting have found their way into this 160 or so page book. So we have much to cover. I'd like to begin first with the idea of serendipity and of strolling around. You argue that great bookstores create a total environment in which readers and would-be readers browse in, you write, a state of curiosity and receptivity, chewing their intellectual cud. Tell us about this total environment, why it provides a counterpoint to digital distraction, wakes us up, and encourages uncertainty, which is a brilliant thing in your opinion.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, and it is such a pleasure to be in this space. This is an incredible institution. We were planning a tour, the idea of actually being able to come here and speak to this community and meant a lot to me, so I'm really glad that you're here. I do keep company with Walt Whitman and Simone Weil, and I do have all these friends, and really these wonderful friends that I get to spend my days with, just like you do. In fact, we might share some friends. Right, it is a totalizing environment. I mean, we're in a book space, and this book space is used. It's utilized for exactly what these are meant to do, which is engage the reader and bring out things in ourselves that we didn't even know existed. One of the things that I was trying to answer in writing the book was, why do we even need bookstores in the 21st century? The obvious answer that bookstores are meant to sell books, but we actually don't need bookstores to do that. So what do we need them for? And it is the browsing experience and what happens to the reader who is wandering the stacks, and mentioned the serendipity, but really also it's like what opens up in the soul when we are engaged with those books. And I remember Borges was one of the readers that I engaged, not writers, but readers. He fancied himself a reader first. And I engaged. He said, well, people would critique him and say, why are you going out there and just reading books? Like, go live a life. And live a life. This is what it means to live a life. And I get to live all these lives. I get to live many lives and all of these stories. And the notion that we can do that in these spaces is something that I have experienced, and I want to share that experience with anyone who will listen.
And I just want to double down on this idea there of serendipity, because as you say, in a digital landscape of digital distraction where everything is kind of predetermined, let's say, by an algorithm, why is this idea of serendipity and of surprise and of unexpected encounters so important?
Yeah, so mentioning Walt Whitman, one of his most famous lines is, I contain multitudes. And there's a recognition that we aren't really nouns. We aren't a thing that has been crystallized as much as we're verbs. So we're constantly engaging the world in new ways, and we're constantly figuring out different ways to be human. And in order to be challenged, in order to learn something, uncover something in the self that we didn't know was there, in order to be surprised or delighted by a new way of thinking or a new way of articulating something, only can happen if we're finding the thing that we're not looking for. And an algorithm will only show you what you're looking for. What happens when you're brought to the thing that you didn't know you wanted?
There's something also spiritual in some sense about this. So you describe bookstores using the Celtic concept of thin places. Thin places, you write, are physical places where earth seems to draw closer to heaven. These thin places where we find ourselves amid something far greater, and in doing so, we become our more authentic selves. Can you talk about this idea of thin spaces and also Thoreau's notion of thick spaces and how both find their way into the bookstore?
Thank you for that question. That's great. I actually didn't say that. It was, no, it's in the book. It's
there.
it's Gregory Shemden, who's a Catholic chaplain at Georgetown University. He wrote this. And this is a religious figure. We are not a religious bookstore. It's called the Seminary Co-op because it was founded by students at the Chicago Theological Seminary. It then was expanded into one of the largest academic and scholarly bookstores of the world. That said, it does attract a lot of religious people, and I count myself among them, even though my religion really is about the books above all. And yes, so Gregory Shemden wrote this beautiful essay, and it's for the student newspaper, and saying that there's this Celtic notion of thin places where heaven and earth kind of come together a little bit closer. Maybe the veil of heaven is lifted, and we can see into it. And those spaces exist. There are landscapes, and he has found that stores like the Seminary Co-op, he names, and City Lights Booksellers in San Francisco, he names, are also thin places. They're places where he can, see beyond what the everyday is. Now, the role writes about thick places that are thick with others, busy and crowded and cacophonous, and perhaps cities have this quality to them. A bustling bookstores have this quality too. And one of the things that I observe is that there are thick places that don't make us feel that, or we don't sense the cacophony. We don't feel overwhelmed, and actually we feel like we are amongst friends, and that we also paradoxically can be solitary in that space.
So we mentioned religion, and you yourself grew up in an Orthodox Jewish community in and around Brooklyn. We're going to go back to this because it certainly shapes your experience of reading and your encounter with reading early on. I want to go back to this environment that we find in the bookstore because it also creates a temporal environment. You write that the time that we find in the bookstore is slow or immersive, like the hour of the browse itself. It makes us receptive to the memory of humanity and uninterested in the ephemera created by speed and efficiency. You cite another brilliant writer, critic, and writer, Elizabeth Hardwick, who writes, "Time is what our contemporary existence is determined to shorten. Time is that curious loss in a world of time saving." Tell us about the deliberately patient pace of nature, as you put it, capital N nature in bookstores.
Yeah, great, thank you. So what happens when we open a book? What happens when we walk into a bookish space? There's something that it's almost paradoxical. Time slows down, and it focuses us on the immediate present. But what it also does is it dilates, and it expands to include all of history, or wherever we are. Virgil Thompson, who of course, and think about like Gertrude Stein and Virgil Thompson hanging out together and trying to come up with operas or whatever they were doing. And we have this space that allows us to really take our time with things. And one of the points that is, I think, clear to all of us is that we live in such a hurried world. We are constantly rushing to get things done. And yet it's the most efficient world that we'll probably have. We probably need less of that. We might have more time than our ancestors did if we look at the history of work and how things operate. And yet we are constantly chasing after what? What are we doing with this time? And so there's the fifth chapter is on time, and it speaks to, it opens with Seneca, the philosopher Seneca, who talks about how the one thing that is the most valuable in the world, time, is the very thing that we don't hold precious. And something about, not every book will do this, but the endeavor of browsing, reading, contemplating, ruminating, being among community around the book does not just slow us down, but fill that time with the concentrated life.
And this idea of time is so important to you in the bookstore that you actually adopted the phrase "stranger, here you will do well to tarry." By another philosopher, Epicurus. Tell us about why you chose that as your inscription for the bookstore.
Yeah, it's a stranger, here you'll do well to tarry. Here our greatest good is pleasure. And pleasure to Epicurus, it's not the Epicurean pleasure we think of today about eating fine food. It's actually about friendship and contemplation. That was what Epicurus, the pleasure that Epicurus cultivated in his garden. It's called the garden. It's a little subversive why I chose Epicurus. So as mentioned, I grew up Orthodox Jewish, and Epicurus is a really bad guy in the Jewish world. Why? I'm not sure why. It's maybe because Epicurus thinks that the gods exist, but they don't care what we do. They're not invested in our lives one way or the other. I'm not entirely sure. But the worst epithet that one could call a Jew that was raised the way I was is an apikoros, which is the Aramaic translation of Epicurus. And what it means is somebody who knows better, was trained in the Talmudic way, and doesn't live as they ought. Maybe they studied the Greeks and the Romans, and actually that is because of when the Talmud was written. Those are the enemies. It's not, the enemies are Aristotle and Plato and Epicurus. And so it was a little bit of a new joke for me. Like, oh, I'm going to actually be an apikoros, and I'm going to lean into this, and it stings. I heard it growing up. It stung. My aunt who's religious recently told me that I'm trying to become like an apikoros rabbi, which I thought was the best compliment, and I might title my next book the apikoros rabbi. But the idea that this is these are grounds for rumination, for friendship, for community, and for inquiry. That is what a bookstore should do. So we will do all to carry. And I think there's an important point, and I touched on this in the book. Christopher Morley talks about this. The idea that we don't really understand how to use bookstores or book spaces, and that we could understand them differently. And I'm thinking about this recently, actually, since the book was written. But the way that an avant-garde novelist or poet really needs to, or not an avant-garde, just innovative, needs to train the reader how to read their book, right? You can, and if you do it really well, you don't need an introduction. You just there needs to be some trust between the reader and the writer. In a similar way, I think that we, as booksellers, should consider training or opening up pathways to engaging the bookshop in a different way than we've done.
It's so interesting, as a total aside, but it's to this point of training the reading, because it's the centenary of Ulysses, City of Joyce's Ulysses, and so much of, I think maybe the conversation's kind of finished now, because it was Doomsday in June, but we've certainly been celebrating it here, because the library did a podcast with Shakespeare and Company, other fantastic bookshop in Paris. And Joyce said kind of, or maybe he didn't say explicitly, but certainly critics of Joyce have observed that in the beginning of the book, he's essentially training the reader up for the Oxford Sun.
Exactly. Well, and so there are a couple of things in there. One is Joyce's Ulysses is a great example because, and again, so is Richard Stein. I mean, you open these books and you have no idea what's happening. And the reader just has to trust. And if they trust, there is an incredible payoff, not just in the reading, but the rereading. Training them for Oxford of the Sun, might be my least favorite episode. But I think that makes sense. But the other thing that I love about Ulysses is without the bookstore, without Shakespeare and Company, Ulysses isn't published, or not in the same way. And so one of the things that when we talk about a bookstore, what do we need for in the 21st century? It's not just to buy and sell books. Well, in the 20th century, the best among us weren't just buying and selling books either. Sylvia Beach built a legacy for all of us to follow about what it means to be a literary citizen, what it means to think about authors, readers, publishers, censors, governments, how to fight for literature.
Such a great point, and it's related to this idea of slowing down time, I think, because another way that you're slowing down time is that you are slowing down the time that you leave books on the shelves, so that the average bookstore, and you'll explain to us why this is important, the average bookstore leaves books on its shelves for 132 days, and at your bookstore, you leave books on the shelves for 280 days. You give them the time to settle, the time to rise, and the time to flourish. Why is it important also to slow time down in the industry of publishing and of culture more broadly today?
It's the chef's wisdom that time itself is an ingredient, right? So first of all, the average bookstore carries a book for 130 days. That's the average really good bookstore. So it's like the above average bookstore. The average above average bookstore does it for 130 days. And how long do books take to write? How long do books take to read? How long do books take to sit on the shelf even after you buy them and you get to them? We all buy ambitiously, as though we have nothing to read at home. And all of those books at home, they're not ready. They're green. They need to write them. And that's what they're doing, is they take them home and they're writing it. And in the meantime, you need to go find some new ones. And some of them, you're going to be immediately and some you won't. And I think that there's that interplay between our various selves or various moods that it does take time. And why shouldn't it? That is, after all, again, the most precious commodity, according to Seneca, and for many of us. And what are we trying to do in finding these books that match the mood? It's like read them at just the right time. It's like, how many of you have read books that were just, you read it at the wrong time, you knew you were going to love it, it just was a mismatch, or you read it at exactly the right time and you could never read it again and you could never come back to it. It was just right. And that's the art of that matchmaking.
And so, and just to go briefly back to this idea of dilation and compression, one of the reasons why we find compression here and compression in bookstores and in libraries across the world is because of these constructed categories. So in your bookstore, you created as one example, but there are many kind of funny ones and more serious ones and very kind of innovative ones. So you created the category of comparative religion, and so, as you say, create new and felicitous pairings. So William James finds himself next to Karen Armstrong, for example. Tell us how these categories collapse time and create these new pairings, which is also a kind of serendipity in its own way.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's also, well, I want to point to the work of bookselling in order to answer that question, because the work of bookselling, as far as I see it, is not retailing. It's not buying and selling. When we buy and sell, that's about where we source and how our supply chain works and what we do in terms of customer service and quality. Books are the same. They're manufactured by one person. They're sold by that person. We have a fixed price. The way it works here is much more evolved than the way it works in the States, but it's still a fixed price. And we can't really work as retailers. So what is the work? The work is about filtration, going through all of the tens of thousands of books that are published by major publishers every year and filtering out the things that we think or filtering out the things that don't work for our communities, selecting the things that do. And then the third piece is what you're describing, which is assembling them. There's an assemblage factor that is what creates those incredible browsing grounds. And the serendipity actually is not as accidental as it seems. We're putting books, and this is what happens in this collection too. You're putting books out that are here for a reason. We acknowledge that this community in some way is interested in or assuming interested in these books, has shown interest. We think that it would show interest if they saw them, and we want to create these assemblages that are just right for the discovery that you'll, as a reader, have of the book that you didn't know you needed.
So tell us about the great table.
Yeah, we have a
front table.
We have a front table.
Capital F, capital P.
The good table, capital G, capital T. Everything is good. Good life, good society, good bookstore, good table. It's at the front table, and it's just a table at the front of the store with 116 titles. Because we carry books that are often not featured elsewhere, they're by scholarly and academic presses, literary presses. The assemblage that we create with these 116 titles and the story that tells, that is a snapshot of the intellectual moments. And that moment might not, I mean, some of those books are 2 years old. Some of those books are 2 days old. But that is the snapshot that we put out and say, this will give you a sense of what you'll find in the stacks, but also what is of interest right now in the community. And because it's anti-disciplinary and it really troubles any notion of category, it is probably the best example of what we do well with booksellers, because all those categories, as Alberto Manguel writes when he writes about categorization, every book needs to be rescued from its category. A good book is a singular thought, just like we're all singular, and it's rescued from its category. The categories are meant to help, discovery, but they're not actually all that interesting in and of themselves.
Yeah, you're right. The front table is emblematic of the approach of good bookstores. It reflects a commitment to books that endure and are relevant outside any given publishing season.
Absolutely. Well, and so there's this notion of books of the moment and books of all time. And one of the things that we're looking for are books that endure or should endure. And thinking about how many books are published each year, in hundreds of thousands, and then how many books are actually make it beyond the 6-month period, 3-month period. I personally look at about 30,000 titles every year that are published that year to see if we want to bring them to the shop. And also look at about 30,000 books that were published in prior years that sold and decide whether or not to bring them back into the shop. And that, if we're doing our jobs well, more and more of those titles will actually be ones that we want to bring back and we want to be carrying for years to come. That is part of how we operate.
Have you feel like you kind of preemptively discovered a writer? Or
I mean, all the time, but I wouldn't say we preemptively, it's really the publisher preemptively did. And we trust those publishers. Publishers are great partners. I'm a big, we don't read most of the books, if any of them. I'm catching up on books that were published years and years ago. It really is, the bookselling world is this intuitive sense based on all of the relationships we have, how we read the community. There's this beautiful notion about booksellers being readers of reading. We understand how readers work. That actually is what we're taking in. We're not reading every book and making decisions based on the book. It would be an absurd notion. Do the math for yourselves of how many books you read in a year and how many years you expect to live and read books. It's discouraging, perhaps. Although I highly recommend rereading. Don't be discouraged about rereading. It's not about getting the right, it's like the quality, not the quantity of the books.
yeah, because I mean, if there are kind of two main thrusts of the book, one is to praise the environment of bookstores, and the other is to praise the expertise of book sellers, right? You describe them as readers of reading, transcendental readers, and they're also great listeners, right? They should be able to have a conversation with somebody in the bookstore and then possibly lead them to some suggestions.
That's right. And having the conversation, you're right, it's listening. So having the conversation is mostly about becoming a conduit for the reader to help articulate what it is they're looking for, and then bring these conversations that we've had with other readers to bear and say, oh, if this is what you're interested in, I know from speaking with all of these dozens of other readers, this is the kind of thing that you would probably be drawn to. These are the kinds of books you probably come out to, and that listening is critical.
And it's also part of the community that you're creating. So I want to go back to this idea of the front table, because it relates, I think, to the question of confrontation and encounter. I think confrontation also relates to the community that you've created at Chicago's Seminary Co-op, but it's also the type of community that you hope good bookstores should create. So you write at Contemporary America, our public discourse is not functional where it exists at all. There are so few spaces for conversation and meaningful encounter. The good bookstore, you add, serves as one such place to hold explicit and tacit public conversation. So there's the conversation between the bookseller and the buyer. There's a conversation between fellow book buyers, between fellow booksellers. There's also a conversation that one has with the book that one's reading. Tell us about the importance of bookstores as places of community and places, as you say, great leveling as well.
Right. So bookstores and libraries both are these democratic institutions where anybody can walk in without gatekeeping. And you don't need to test into the space. And you could test out of things that you don't want to read. So if you want to read, for instance, book 5 of Spinoza's Ethics, because book 5 is where all the good stuff is about God, if you like that kind of thing, then you can just skip right to book 5. You can walk in and you can pick up Gertrude Stein or Ulysses and just decide, I'm going to read it, and I don't need any prerequisites. One of the things that we have, it's a really beautiful community. We run the South Side of Chicago, and South Side of Chicago is a historically Black community that has been under resourced for decades, including by the city explicitly, including recently. And it coexists with the very resourced University of Chicago. And the exchange between those communities is one that we are the nexus of. And we get to see all of the Nobel laureates walking around with children who have had no opportunities to, by their municipality to be educated in a similar way, and they're exchanging ideas, and they're following the same flight paths, and they're working the same ground, they're browsing the same stacks, and engaging those ideas in a way that is absolutely beautiful. And there are really very few other spaces where one can find that.
You write to your community, Jeff, you say good bookstores reflect their community, exceptional bookstores both reflect and create their communities. How do you feel you're creating a community?
Yeah, I won't say how I am, but I'll say the story, because I do think that the story does, and my predecessors and the colleagues I have now are doing this all the time. The Seminary co-op is in some way, and I'm going to, this is going to sound hyperbolic, but I'm going to bring to the stories. It's just fragmented in there. And part of the reason why is it's a particular way of life, it's a particular way of being in the world. There is nothing else like it. And it is an argument on behalf of that way of being. What is that way of being? And yeah, it's this anti-disciplinary, incredibly democratic, incredibly capacious and expansive vision of what it means to be a leader and a human. And the sorts of books that we've carried through the years isn't just reflect the University of Chicago. This bookstore was what created the culture of the University of Chicago as much as it reflected it. In a way that if we were in New Haven, where Yale is, we might have made Yale a better university for it. And by which I mean that actual engagement of ideas and the commitment to becoming learned, above educated, and the commitment to engage in community around ideas of literature.
This is an interesting distinction. Tell us about learned and educated and the distinction you make in the book.
Yeah, there's a distinction that I grew up with, actually. Again, with the Orthodox Jewish upbringing, we were raised to be learned. And the examples I had, I mean, there were books everywhere when I was growing up. The examples that I had were no matter what the work was, everyone in the community would come home and they would study every day. The study, the life of the mind it was not meant just for scholars. It didn't matter if you were working construction or like my grandfather was a suit salesman, worked in schmuck business as we called it, and they'll come home and study deeply and study these texts that were incredibly important, but also obscure and difficult and challenging and intellectually rich. There's never been a notion that after any certain number of years, one was stamped educated. And then didn't need to open a book or learn anything new because they did what they had to do and then became educated. Being learned is a way of life, and it is something that happens until the day we die. And that notion is critically important to me. It's something that I understood as the reason we engage these books in the first place is not because we don't want to read them anymore once we're 25 or 30, but because we want to spend a life reading deeper and deeper and having a richer engagement with these texts.
So it's the story of Socrates learning how to play the song in his 3 minutes before he dies. Can you tell us this story? It's so lovely.
Right. Well, it's the idea that we shouldn't need knowledge in order to accomplish something else. That knowledge is an end in itself, and the idea that there is the usefulness of the useless, and that what other reason do we need to have to learn the food other than to learn the food? And if we'll buy tomorrow, we're still going to learn the food.
I want to go back to this Orthodox Jewish community to ask you. This is one tension that I found in the book, and I wanted to ask you about it because you kind of extol the binding element of unified study. You write cannot be overstated because not only were you raised in a tradition in which all readers engage in the same texts, but you point out they engage in the same text at the same time.
That's right.
And yet, elsewhere in the book, you celebrate the dissolution of the canon, writing that after all, no book suits all palates and no canon is shared between more than a few. This is a fact worthy of celebration. So at a time when the Western canon, among others, canons in general are under siege, is there a case to be made for this kind of dream of a common language in the secular realm of the literary world?
This is a personal answer for me, and I think that because I was raised in Orthodoxy and rebelled against that Orthodoxy, and I found that Orthodoxy suffocating, and I didn't believe in the God that I was raised to believe in, and all of the books are lead us to believe in that God. I'm really interested in heterodoxy, and I'm really interested in all of us finding our own way. And I think that I think that the dream of a common language is something of a nightmare because we're uncommon. And that, the Tower of Babel, the idea of the Tower of Babel with some utopian vision, like most utopian visions, it actually is a nightmare. Because what binds us together is the interest in books, that some of these universal ideas, perhaps about finding meaning and purpose and joy and justice and those kinds of pleasure, deep pleasure, awe and wonder, these sorts of qualities and experiences that we look for, that could be the binding element. And we're all individual, and we all have our stories to tell also. And I think part of it is the stories are told over and over again, but every single time we tell them, they're told differently. They mean something different. And what then can we do as a culture to allow for the individuality of it? Now, I've gotten some critique on this, especially from religious readers who say, well, what do you mean? Like, you just build your own canon? I mean, that's like, it's just going to be chaos. And like, what are we afraid of? We're actually afraid of being the individuals that we are.
So in other words, community can exist without linguistic, homogeneity.
It does. I mean, that's the only way. It's almost like saying, well, it should be. I mean, this is the orthodoxy. Like, everyone should be within these parameters, and yet the world doesn't work that way. We're not within those parameters. So the argument kind of falls flat the second it comes out of your mouth.
Let's talk more about this community, because this community of the bookstores, your bookstore, or not anymore, we'll get to it, are endangered, and as we'll go on to see, they're under attack, they're under siege. So you point out in 1994, there were 7,000 independent bookstores in the US. In 2019, by contrast, there were 2,500 of those. Few bookstores left, and even fewer of those 2,500 sell books exclusively. So you spend time in the book talking about how there are the bookstores, the kind of very serious, let's say, the great bookstores that sell mostly only books, and then the other ones that kind of subsidize their lack of profits with socks and board games and presents.
Well, this is the heart of the definition of the good bookstore, actually. So bookstores inherited a model that was built for traditional retail, and was never built to support bookstores themselves, and certainly not bookstores that sell serious books or books that sell slowly, or literary books, books for a smaller audience. And the idea that we could, maybe should, build deliberately what we inherited from a different business. Retail is not bookselling. If we built that deliberately, we wouldn't force booksellers to sell things other than books. It's hard enough to sell books. If they wanted to sell coffee or socks because that is what they want to provide their community, that's amazing. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's a decision that's made. And if they decide they don't want to do that, then there should be a financial model to support it. Similarly, if a bookseller wants to sell bestsellers and really just stock the things that are going to sell in high quantities and turn them quickly, not 120 days, but 30 days, they sell every 30 days, something like that. Great. That is a wonderful service to the community. Clearly, there's a high demand for those books, but it shouldn't be an economic necessity that they have to sell those books if they are looking to create a community around books that sell slower. So if there's any argument in this book, it is that we should, and by we, it's really booksellers and publishers taking the lead, but you as a community that cares about these spaces, we should imagine a financial model that's different, that actually allows us to do the work that we're meant to be doing.
So tell us about this new model.
Well, ours is one of many. So the model that we have, we went not-for-profit. We became a not-for-profit bookstore in 2019. Frankly, it was an acknowledgement of the work we'd already been doing for decades, which was losing money as a retail endeavor, but we were incredibly successful as a cultural endeavor, and the cultural dividends that we had were the things that we were working toward, and the financial losses, we found ways to work around them. How did we find those ways? We raised money elsewhere, and we then just codified that in 2019. And we're going to continue to do that work, which is saying that if we can't make money from buying and selling books, in fact, it costs us money to sell books, which I don't know if it's true for all bookstores, but it's true for us. But it costs us money to sell books, and it costs us money to sell books while paying a ridiculously low wage to booksellers, and it still costs us money. We should be paying more for the valuable service the booksellers provide. How can we raise that money elsewhere? And there are ways of selling these services. There are ways of asking the public, not just individuals, but institutions and foundations and municipalities to support the stores because they're tremendous value for the community.
So has there been I imagine there has, what has the response across America, maybe even worldwide, to you highlighting the fact that this is a broken economic model and proposing a new model?
It's interesting. So for our community, we've been talking about it for a while, and there's definitely interest in it. We're actually doing a fundraiser right now. Feel free to donate, sendcoop.com. And we, when the book came out, there was an a foundation that came to us and gave us a really big check to acknowledge the work that we were doing. And then there was also an individual who wrote us into his will, saying I wouldn't be who I am, and I wouldn't have the wealth, the financial wealth that I have, but also the spiritual wealth that I have, the intellectual wealth that I have, and the meaning that I have without the seminary co-op. And so I want to make sure that there is money to keep this going for future generations. But for the public at large, who hasn't really given us any thought, nor should they. I mean, these stores are really not meant, you shouldn't be thinking about the stores themselves, you should be enjoying them in theory, but they're under threat. And so initially there's like a defensiveness saying, well, just sell more books or sell them better or do your job better. Like, can't you just figure out? Other people are figuring it out. You must be able to. Waterstones is amazing, and Barnes and Noble is figuring it out. And the reality is that they're not. As soon as we start articulating why these stores aren't making money, and the answer is there are incredibly wise inefficiencies that are the very thing that make these stores special, and that costs money. And if we want to continue to thrive in the way that we have, and doing our work in the way that we're meant to, then it's going to cost money. And slowly, there has been a recognition of, oh, actually, that makes a lot of sense. And oh, wait, how much are you paying staff? We just raised our starting salaries to $17 an hour, which is below living wage and over 50% above the industry average for booksellers. It is an abomination. And so we're just trying to get to a point where we can, pay halfway decent salaries, living wages, and create a professional track for booksellers if they can continue to do that work. And it's only going to happen if the communities who care about these spaces and the readers who care about them find creative ways to support the stores. Not everyone has the financial means, but there are other ways of doing it, and we as a culture and society need to preserve them. I'm saying all this in Paris. You all have this figured out in a way that we don't. Although I'm sure I actually know for a fact it's still at risk, and there's still a lot of problems. But we look to you as one of the models of what does it mean for a culture to really value their books, bookstores, libraries, or institutions around the book, and we don't have that.
Do you think there should be more state intervention, public policy that funds cultural institutions?
I'm a realist, so no. I don't think it's necessary. I think there are ways to work around it. I think perhaps once upon a time I would have felt that way, and libraries were established through initially through private funding. I think the bookstores can be done that way too, and then the state can follow after, just like I did with the libraries. I
want to just think briefly. I have two more questions. One about this question of worth, and then we'll end on Amazon, unfortunately. But you'll elevate. Okay, let's start with Amazon. We'll go to Amazon first, and then we can end with worth. We do need to talk about Amazon because Amazon is the evil interloper in the book. You write systems like Amazon are false, unnatural and destructive, hiding none of your emotions about Amazon. Tell us why Jeff Bezos chose books as his first product and why he promptly turned them into loss leaders, and what loss leaders are and why we don't like Mr. Bezos here or anywhere.
Ooh, wait, hold on. We gotta slow this down. I don't think Amazon's evil, and I don't know Jeff Bezos. I hope there are people in the world who like him. Maybe I hope there are. I'm sure there are. And it's not. And there are so many people who benefit from Amazon. So, and they pay way better than booksellers do. So there's a lot to recommend Amazon. And I only say that because I think that it's important to acknowledge that what people do is the evil part. Like, if there's evil, it's in the action. It's not in the person. It's not in the institution. And I still hold that hope that Amazon can fix the problem that they broke. And if Amazon decided to just put the money back into the industry, put the money that they took out of the industry back into the industry, that would change everything. And that actually is probably the easiest and most just solution to this, because Amazon did do tremendously evil things over the last 30 years. So you're not wrong.
So what adjective would you use?
I would say that they
judicious adjective.
No, I want to be accurate. Because I think that what Amazon did, so I write in here, John Ruskin has this beautiful notion about the 5 intellectual professions, and one of them is the merchant, and talks about, again, and this is retail, but what does it mean to bring goods to a community and to do it as cheaply as possible? That actually is a virtue. And one would think, in hearing that Bezos actually is the hero, and making sure that people can have access to books. We wouldn't want access to, argue with low prices. How can we argue with that? I mean, it's really elitist to think that, masses shouldn't have books and they should be unaffordable. And Amazon is convenient for so many people. So clearly they're doing something right. But Ruskin also then points out, in order to be a good merchant, every step along the way, the supply chain and the producer and the supplier and delivery people and all that, there should be proper remuneration for every step of the way. I mean, this is where I think Amazon has really lost their moral sense, if they have one. Now, did they have one? Okay, so I don't know, but what I will say about Jeff Bezos, why did Jeff Bezos choose books as the beginning for Amazon? Because they were uniform sizes and they were easy to ship. And this is not a joke. He said this in 1994 when he first started. He shared that, he said it out loud, and he's proud of it. And in fact, it's actually really smart. If you're going to try and ship a bunch of things, there are millions of books out there. Everyone wants books at different times for different reasons, and they're easy to ship. And so that was.
But then he took the next step, right? Because he sold these products at a loss in order to attract customers to subscribe into Amazon so that they can purchase higher margin, like socks.
Right. Well, and Jeff Bezos, and this is true of a lot of Silicon Valley companies, lost money for years, and it was investors understanding that this guy is brilliant. He's got more and more market share, and so they're going to put money in, and he was able to put millions into the company while losing money. It's something that no bookstore or small business can do. If you want to read about how evil Amazon is, there's a great book called How to Resist Amazon and Why by my colleague Danny King, who runs a bookshop in Lawrence, Kansas, called The Raven, and he really breaks down all of the problems, and he does it better than I do. I am an enthusiast. Part of where I'm personal is because you're not wrong in everything you're saying, but I'm an enthusiast, and I believe in humanity, I believe in the bookshop, and I believe we're going to figure this thing out. And as far as I'm concerned, I take Nietzsche's dictum, who said we're only going to be yes-sayers, we're no longer going to be naysayers, and turning away will be our only negation. I want to just turn away from that and focus on all of the joy and love. And that there's like one tinge of negativity in the book, and you're right about that, but let's just celebrate what's great about these things.
Okay, let's end on a positive note then.
Yeah.
So at the end of the book, rather than offering kind of answers apart from this non-profit model, you pose a series of questions. Which of those questions is your kind of most important question that you would tell us, that you would leave us with to think about and reflect on? Maybe they've evolved too, because I was wondering if your questions have evolved as you've been doing so much publicity
Yeah, I mean, I pose questions to you. I mean, and ultimately at the end of the book, I'm saying that this is our problem. It's not the booksellers aren't the ones that are going to be able to figure this out. It's the book lovers, it's the readers, it's anyone who loves spending time in these spaces. And so, that,
Yeah, and I'd love for you to read the last
you
paragraph
want to?
too.
All right.
So
Sure.
moving.
We're going to end on a note of book recommendation. We'll have time for questions. Or,
Yeah.
okay, but there'll be a book recommendation because we have to do that. That's what we do as a profession. Like Borges, I'm a reader first, which also means I'm one of the quiet, bookish thousands who ruminate during a good browse. As much as I have written from the perspective of a career bookseller, it is as a bookstore enthusiast that I file these dispatches. I steward the Seminary Co-op because I want to live in a world with bookstores like the Seminary Co-op. It's a selfish endeavor, really, or it would be if I thought I was the only one. We are a legion, 3000s. But that's the truth of the matter. These bookish landscapes built me as I built them. I hope, like the good life or the good society, that the good bookstore can serve as our ambition. There's something distinctive about the good bookstore, the loss of which would be the loss of a particular way of being in the world.
Now we have lots of time for questions. I will refer you to Seminary Books, who has a microphone, and we have a question.
I can't wait to go home and read your book. Although I do think you're preaching a bit to the converted, but so my question is, okay, you know, the bookstores are amazing places for lifelong learning and service. There are different encounters and they should be subsidized, of course. I mean, nobody's will disagree with that. So then the next generation is texting and buying on Amazon and doing podcasts and audiobooks and you know, so how do we get them into the bookshops and the libraries for that matter? What concretely do we tell our kids whom we raised with books and, you know, celebrating reading and everything you've said so beautifully, but what concretely can we do for the next generation who's not reading?
Thank you for that question. So first of all, I am preaching to the choir delightfully. I want to start with the choir because we need to do this work. And so preachers are trying to galvanize the choir to say, this is something, it's not that we're trying to get you to come into the bookstore. We're going to try to get you to help us figure out the problem of how to finance these shops and how to support them. So I am preaching to the choir, and thank you for that point. I don't know where kids not reading. They're reading all the time. Are they on their phones all the time? Sure. Are we on our phones all the time? Sure. Without these spaces, they won't probably discover books as easy as they would if they had them. I am an inspiration to parents of teenagers everywhere. I didn't read at all when I was a kid. I hated reading. And I was the only person in my family that hated reading. So I would always see books in the house, books being read, books in my community being read, and just that exposure alone, and then the patience to say, they'll find their way, is important. But there are professionals who do literacy work, and I'm not one of them. And it's a great question. That's an important one.
What do you think about book talk?
I love book talk. I don't understand it. I've never seen it. I don't know anything about it. But what I do, here's what I do know about it. What's better than usually young people getting incredibly excited about books and so enthusiastic that they're actually mimicking the work of booksellers and saying, here, you need to read this, and I'm going to tell you why. What's not to love about that? That's great.
Other questions in the room? Yes.
Regarding the point you made about Borges, someone having told him that he should go out and live. Regarding that false dichotomy of that false opposition, to me, the best thing ever said about that was by Harold Bloom, who was reproached at Boston talk show for doing nothing but live. And he said somewhere, to me, he gave the definitive answer. Everything you live is life, including reading.
Exactly.
And something else, you touched on Epicurus, and I would like to know if the Jewish faith would have as much of an execration for his Roman poetic disciple, Lucretius. And Saint Jerome, it was an extraordinary calumny. He said that his wife Lucilla poisoned him because he was so addicted to reading the scrolls of Epicurus that he neglected her. So.
Right, I think the answer is yes.
Other questions? Don't be shy. We've got lots of time. Yes.
Thank you first. This was really lovely, and forgive me if this is such a banal question. But what is the one book that you would take with you to a desert island, a deserted island?
Not a bad question at all, and I would not take my own, my gosh. You know, I've had to read this terrible, I mean, I read such better books than this. I mean, you should buy the I do fiction and a poetry and nonfiction, all three. So I enjoy get three because I'm a bookseller. Okay. For fiction, I would bring a book called Divine Days by William Forrest, which, if you have not read this novel, it is one of the best novels I've ever read. It's also really large, so it will keep you entertained for days. We were talking about Joyce earlier, and it is something like the Ulysses for the South Side of Chicago. It takes place over a week in 1966. The protagonist hears voices, and their voices of memory and ancestors and the community around him, and he reflects them back as a playwright, and it's gorgeous. I would also then bring the Tao Te Ching. So there's my nonfiction book, which is 81 verses, very, very short verses. Probably we can recite them in 20 minutes, speaking very slowly. And every page we're reading some of the finest wisdom I've ever read. And then probably the book that's closest to the Bible for me is Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, which I think just captures the truth of the way of the world. So those are my three.
Do you change your answers at different times?
It's funny, yes.
As these books like in.
Yes, I've been told that my top 50 is very capacious, and what would you say?
Okay, I'll think about it. Come back to you.
Oh,
But no, I promise I'll say I don't have it ready at hand.
Other questions in the room?
that wasn't an album. Thank you for that question.
We've got a question on Zoom as well from Kate. Kate is concerned that we are losing the book object itself. She says the experience of holding it, turning the pages, enjoying the illustrations, being able to turn the pages back and forth. Do we think that this is being lost because of Kindle and ebooks and all of that? And is that cause for concern, or is something new coming?
As a bookseller, I'm not concerned about it at all. In fact, I think it's wonderful. I think that there is an accessibility that ebooks and audiobooks provide that the traditional book hasn't always been as accessible, and whatever gets people to the book and to the content of the book is wonderful. So I think it's great. I also, my mother is a good example. She's a huge reader. She loves reading. The Kindle will always be in large print. She doesn't think too hard about it, but also can fall asleep reading. I literally, when I was reading Divine Days, which is 1,200 pages, and I would be lying down reading it, I literally got tennis elbow. I'm not making that up. I'm reading this book in like 9 months. It's not fun, but I wouldn't have if I read it in ebooks. So no, I don't know. That's outside of my purview, but I think it's wonderful that there's accessibility that might not have existed otherwise.
Other questions? I have a question, if I can ask one. I noticed there's a smartphone sitting on the table, which I believe belongs to you. Do you think that owning one has changed your reading habits?
It's changed everything. Yeah, and definitely in a bad way for me. And I remember that the moments, I mean, what happened to the brain pre and post. Absolutely. No, I am not. It is sitting there for sure. We're keeping time up here. I'm texting a little bit when you're not looking, because none of us have pens anymore. But no, it's a good question, because it's actually one of the reasons why I think the bookstore is so important now, is that it is, like you sell it, it is the sort of thing that can focus us in a way that the smartphone really disturbs that focus. And how many of us, and you're all good readers, and you're obviously showing up for a book about bookstores, how many of you start reading a book and you're good readers, and you can't get through a page, maybe what is it, 6 times you're checking your phone before you can get through a page and then actually keep going? I mean, I think this happens to all of us, and it's horrible. And should we all just have some more self-control? But we don't, because we've established this, and I don't. Yeah, so thank you for shaming me publicly. No, but yeah, that's a problem. And I do think that, and there are spaces that like bookstores that don't allow phones, and I think that that's unnecessary and didactic and probably condescending. But it is crazy to think about how long it takes us to really put our phones down. One of the things that the Jewish community and others have to do this as well, but in the Jewish community, the Sabbath, where we have to turn everything off, and even just a digital Sabbath, is a really holy experience in this knowledge.
You alluded to some of the changes in the campus bookstore, and I'm curious to hear about the conversations you had about not selling merch, right? Because that is one solution for a lot of campus bookstores. And so as you can imagine, this store is absolutely worth a pilgrimage to Chicago. And it has none of that stereotypical feel that you see so often now with the hoodies and whatnot. So I'm wondering if you have any baptism experiences of U of C students who, US colleges are so competitive now. We're finding a lot of students who they don't really identify as readers, right? They're high achievers, and it might be only in graduate school that they have time to read for pleasure after graduate school. Do you have any recent experiences with students coming to the book maybe for the first time in a real way?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Well, we have a lot of students who come in, first year students who come in and say, wait, where's the real bookstore that has the sweatshirts? And this is a true thing that happens every year. When I started, and I came from a traditional campus bookstore, in fact, two of them, one at Stanford University and one at UC Berkeley, and they both make it work financially because they sell a lot of hoodies and T-shirts and diploma frames and things of that sort, notebooks, things like that. And it's a model that works, but there are fewer and fewer books in most of these. In fact, they stopped calling them bookstores about 15 years ago and started calling them campus stores, which was to the faculty, thank God, was an abomination, but they didn't have enough power to change it. I do get to see it. It's really special. I mean, I've been on college campuses for almost 20 years now, running these bookstores, and watching a first year student come in, and they're so confused, and they haven't been in the store quite like this, most of them, and they're there because they have to be there, and it's a chore, and it's not fun, it's not pleasurable. And anyone who becomes a bookseller, the reason you do it, this is the place where people come for joy and nourishment. It's not a chore. It's not, you're going to the mechanic or whatever. You're doing it because you love it, and to see people who have to read or require reading and what that experience is like, it's discouraging. And then year goes by and another year, and they're in the stores and they're learning, and they're in the spaces maybe where their professors speak about their latest work, and just watching that enchantment happen and establishing that commitment or relationship to the space. It's beautiful, and I see it every cohort that comes through. Not all of them, but enough of them. And this is kind of the answer, like what gives us hope about the reading and the future of students or kids aren't reading. That you can pick up the habit at any point, and oftentimes they do. What's your desert island?
Okay. I had a think. I get one of each section.
Whatever you want.
Okay, I have one of them's a sponsor, but it is a brilliant debut by a British novelist who will speak there in January, called Natasha Brown. She wrote this book called Colony. It's a fantastic debut. It's my fiction. If I had it, can I have two? Okay, well, the other one, I don't know if people have read Marion Robinson's Housekeeping, but that is my favorite fiction book. I always return to it. If you haven't read it, I would highly recommend it. For non-fiction, I was just thinking about books that truly changed my life, I would say, and it's in part, it's a retort to your anti-canonization points, because both Emily and he went to Columbia, where we have so much required reading, and I wouldn't have discovered this book or many of the books that at first glance I didn't want to read, but this book is The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois is so beautifully written and makes so many compelling points. It's not necessarily an undiscovered gem, but I would recommend it. And then in terms of poetry, I would recommend the Upanishads. Yeah.
In terms of poetry, I love it. One quick thing on the Upanishads, and then it's poetry. Another thing that the Jewish world does very well is the way that they engage books, and it's not the way in academia we engage it through criticism, but it's through commentary. It's to try and expand upon it. And Hinduism is very similar, and the commentaries of the Upanishads are it's almost like read the Upanishads so that you can read the commentaries as well, and commentaries upon the commentaries, just like in the Jewish world. It's fantastic. So I love those are three great ideas. Before.